The first gunfire of the American Revolution was referred to by Ralph Waldo Emerson as the shot heard around the world. Suddenly, this handful collection of colonies was at the helm of a landmass that dwarfed the size of all other countries in Western Europe. But had it really been so sudden? Great Britain started the successful colonization of America in 1607 with Jamestown, a colony plagued with death from the beginning. But even likely, death wasn't going to stop the flood of British men and women from making the 3,000-mile ocean voyage to what they had hoped would be a brighter future. Some 13 years after the founding of Jamestown, the Mayflower Compact, the first written form of self-governance by British colonists, was signed in 1620, a little more than 155 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The road to war between Great Britain and its American colonies began to unfold during the 7 Years' War, a conflict between France and Britain that engulfed the entire planet into a giant world war from 1754 to 1763. Disputes about land and trading rights brought violence to the Americas, and both countries nearly bankrupted themselves in the conflict. But Great Britain eventually prevailed and acquired much of French colonial territory and influence around the world. Along with Caribbean, African, and Asian influence, Great Britain about doubled the size of its territories in the modern-day United States, which allowed for more colonial expansion westward. Britain, now broke, believed that the colonies benefited most from the war and believed they should financially support Great Britain for securing the war's outcome. This belief would be exercised first with tariffs and eventually the Stamp Act in 1765. The Stamp Act was a tax on items made out of paper and is so notable because it is the first tax created by Great Britain that is felt by the average colonist. The Stamp Act would be later repealed, but was quickly replaced with the Townshend Acts of 1770. This series of acts was an attempt to set the precedent that the British Parliament had the authority to tax the American colonies. It also included a tax on tea. This became problematic for the colonies who believed they should not be taxed by a parliament in which they were not represented in. As the animosity began to build, Bostonians who were feeling the major front of British colonialism began to get restless. The tension climaxed in 1770 when a group of British soldiers shot into a small mob of protesters and killed 5 people. This would eventually be known as the Boston Massacre and would be a war cry for individuals like Paul Revere to turn moderate colonists into full patriots ready to support the cause. On April 19, 1775, British forces were confronted by colonial militia and countrymen patriots in Massachusetts Bay between the towns of Lexington and Concord. No one knows who shot first, but it seemed the revolution had begun. The colonial patriots were outnumbered heavily, but they used their small size as an advantage as they would take select shots and disappear into the woods. As the British forces continued to march, the Patriot militia continued to instigate small skirmishes and avoid larger conflicts. Learning when to avoid conflicts and staying off the battlefield in a traditional sense would become a tactic that would continue to save the Patriot militia and colonial army while the teeter-totter between defeat and starvation over the course of the war. The Battle of Lexington and Concord, though not an overwhelming strategic victory, added more fuel to the Patriot cause's fire. People still on the fence could now believe there was a chance of defeating the British in an armed conflict. The flood of pro-patriot anti-British literature hit the colonies leading up to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine's common sense put the patriot cause into language understandable to his countrymen, and more minds began to shift. On July 4, 1776, The Constitutional Congress, through unanimous vote, adopted the Declaration of Independence and declared its separation from Great Britain. And though shots were already fired, any hopes in negotiation were now officially over. The individuals who fought the war would be a vast array of people from all sides of the colonies and all corners of the globe. Scottish and Irish Americans who hated the British were eager to take up arms against their homeland oppressors. Great Britain hired 30,000 German troops, called Hessians, to join the war on the side of the Crown. African American slaves were on their own journey to independence as Great Britain offered freedom to any slave who took arms against the rebelling colonies and joined the cause. Native Americans were less concerned about America's cause of the war than what the victory would look like on either side for their people. Most natives chose to side with Great Britain, correctly predicting massive Western expansion with a colonial victory. The Iroquois Confederacy would eventually split up over disagreements on which side to back. 20% of white colonists in America were loyal to British rule. These individuals were called Tories, and by the end of the war, 100,000 of them would leave America never to return again. The patriots in America varied in their resolve to found the new nation. Some, like Sam Adams, were instigating revolution from the start, while others, like his third cousin John Adams, took a little more. Great Britain versus the 13 colonies on papers looks like an easy outcome to call. Great Britain had the world's best navy and some of the best equipped and well-trained soldiers in the history of mankind. However, their opponent was 3,000 miles away, and a lot more formidable than they appeared on the surface. Great Britain's arch-enemy, France, was lying in wait for a moment to regain honor from their loss in the 7 Years' War. The American Revolution started off in the Northern Theater with an impressive display as 30,000 British troops showed up in New York Harbor, forcing George Washington and his men to reluctantly retreat and abandon the city. Washington had hopes of recapturing New York in the war, but it ended up being the last stronghold and the final stop for many English loyalists and former slaves before setting sail after the English defeat in the Battle of Yorktown. In the early years of the war, Washington would go on to lose more battles than he won. However, he learned to keep his casualties low in times of loss and how to make a big impact during times of victory. His micromanaging at Valley Forge helped prevent the spread of disease among soldiers, and with help from Prussian war veteran Frederick von Steuben, they honed a group of men who ranged from farmers to war veterans into a force that they hoped would be able to compete with their British adversaries. On Christmas night, 1777, George Washington led his troops in the frigid cold night across the Delaware River to attack enemy stronghold in Trenton. The attack, though marred by setbacks, was an overwhelming success and began to cement the growing prestige of General Washington amongst his countrymen and soldiers. Great Britain began to grow frustrated with their military's inability to score any real decisive victories over the colonies. This inability to gain a strong foothold in the North inspired Great Britain to shift up his strategy. They assumed correctly to a degree that southern colonies were going to be more sympathetic to the Crown and hopefully more welcoming than places like Massachusetts. General Cornwallis was shipped to America shortly after his wife's death to head the Southern Campaign. The Southern Campaign started strong on the coast. However, they eventually ran into the same problem as the North. The huge British regiments proved to be cumbersome and ineffective at engaging the smaller colonial forces in battle. The colonies in the South began getting restless. It was far easier to remain neutral when the war was hundreds of miles away, but now that it was right on their laps. Brothers began to turn on brothers as everyone was forced to choose a side. General Nathan Greene was tasked with leading the American armed forces in the Southern campaign. Cornwallis became obsessed with capturing Greene, who dragged Cornwallis troops through the rural areas of southern swamps and woods in a giant cat-and-mouse game. Nathaniel Greene's duck-and-weave tactics became too much for Cornwallis's giant forces to close in on, so Cornwallis and his men turned around and headed to Yorktown. 4 years prior to Cornwall's fateful decision to go to Yorktown, British General John Burgoyne led a large army southward of Canada in hopes to be joined up by 2 more regiments. The 2 other regiments never showed, and his men were shortly surrounded by colonial troops. Almost 7,000 British troops would be captured. But more importantly, this battle would capture the imagination of England's arch-nemesis France, as they now believe an American cause was worth backing. France's entrance into the war would be a painfully slow process for the colonials to bear. Benjamin Franklin spent most of the wartime in France on a diplomatic mission to get them to join the war effort. France first sent financial relief, military supplies, and volunteer fighters. When French leadership finally arrived, they made the call where they would concentrate the attack. George Washington wanted a siege in New York. However, France had its sights set on the peninsula of Yorktown, as General Cornwallis wrote letters to his superiors asking for assistance. French naval forces began to surround the peninsula. As George Washington rallied every troop he could find and cut off any chance of an English retreat, they began to tighten the noose around your town. And after 3 weeks of non-stop bombardment, day and night, General Cornwallis had his men surrendered. Roughly 10,000 redcoats lied down their arms and were escorted back to New York and eventually out of the newly formed United States. To secure their position on the world stage, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay worked tirelessly to ensure the new nation and their autonomy would be recognized by major European powers. The United States secured its independence, but the American slave wouldn't receive theirs until 1865, almost 60 years after Great Britain abolished slavery in 1807. The Native American also lost a lot. Immediately after the war ended, American settlers began their journey westward, putting them on a collision course with every tribe between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. It was the words "we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal" that would guide the very flawed American experiment to the hopes of a more perfect union.